All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us in person as well as for online. Today, I have the special privilege and honor to introduce our very honorable guest, Professor Austin Strange. He currently teach at University of Hong Kong, HKU, more importantly, he and I belong to the same scholarly network called the China and the World program at Columbia and Harvard, here at Columbia University, chaired by Professor Tom Christensen. If you don't know me, I'm Zoe Liu. I'm obviously Professor Strange's friend, but I'm also a senior research scholar here at the Columbia IGP. My full-time work is at the Council on Foreign Relations, where I serve as the Maurice R. Greenberg Senior Fellow for China Studies. Today we will we'll hear from Professor Strange for a presentation, and then I will use my moderator's privilege to ask him a whole list of questions. I have 3 pages, but I won't ask all of them. I know that you will probably have a lot of questions, right? So after my question, I will open the floor so that you can ask a question either in person or for our participants. If you have a question, please do join the online queue so that I can get the opportunity to ask you to raise your questions. So without further ado, Professor Strange, the floor is yours.
This one can stay here. Oh. Yep. More. Okay, I did it. Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Austin Strange. Thank you to Zoe for a very nice introduction and for making time to moderate. I really appreciate it. Let me start by just saying thank you to the China in the World program here at Columbia, and of course to the Weatherhead Institute as well. It's really a pleasure to be here. I did a postdoctoral fellowship at Columbia. However, it was in the year 2021, and if you remember what was going on then, this was mostly a virtual experience, so it's always a treat to be able to come back. So thank you all for coming as well. I know it's a busy time, and I'm really excited to share this research with all of you. So this is a project that is called From Mao to Now, a very clever title, I know, China's 20th Century Global Development Finance. And as I'll explain, this is not just any paper to me. It's a very one that's near and dear to my heart. It's a special project to me. What I'd like to do in this presentation is take a step back before I get into the nuts and bolts of the research and really motivate this topic. So why is it interesting within international relations, within international political economy, which is the field that I work in, and also Chinese foreign policy, to study historical Chinese aid and lending in the global south, which is the focus of this project. I'm going to introduce a new data set that is at the center of this work called the Historical Chinese Development Finance Dataset, or HCDF. I'm going to give you a few examples or illustrations of how, even though that this is a data-focused project, how we can use these data to revisit and maybe challenge and extend some of the conventional wisdom about basically the nature and the motivations and the consequences of different types of Chinese overseas capital. And then I'll just talk about sort of the bigger picture and where this research is going. So if you look here, you can see a young man and the top figure there. That's me a long time ago. I've been studying Chinese development finance for a long time. And as I'll explain, the research that I'm going to share today, which is this historical component, the first 5 decades of Chinese aid and lending, I think has really been a missing piece of the puzzle in the study of Chinese development finance for a long time. come to this conclusion after working on this for quite some time. So hopefully you'll start to see what I mean as we go along. So let me just begin with a question. So why is it worth our time to convene today and talk about China's historical Chinese development finance? And particularly by historical, I'm talking about the 20th century, right? There's a lot of attention on the Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of attention on China's 21st century aid and lending. But why go back to, the early PRC? Why go back to the Cold War? What is sort of the value proposition of doing that? I think the answer in general is that not doing so really makes us miss out on a lot of important context, both historical context and comparative context. I think this is an area for which we have not really situated China's contemporary financing alongside, again, both historical and comparative lenses. Within international relations, if you go and look at how we study aid from the United States or the World Bank or other, bilateral and multilateral major donors and lenders, we study all of the evidence that we have. We usually start in the post-war period with the Marshall Plan. We go through the Cold War all the way up to the present day. We haven't done that for China. This has been a very 21st century research agenda. I think this is a reflection of a broader trend that others have called out of focusing on, Chinese foreign policy and what some call global China in isolation and sort of studying China off on its own rather than integrating it into the mainstream. This is a point that I made in a short book that I published a couple of years ago called Chinese Global Infrastructure in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative. But getting a little bit more concrete with this, I think there are some specific things that we miss out on by neglecting China's historical aid and lending. So as I said, this has been a big research agenda in international relations in the past 10 or 15 years. But research on Chinese aid and lending almost always starts in the year 2000. It's a very contemporary agenda. People like myself are partially responsible for that. So we have built data sets that track project by project different, lending and grant making activities of the Chinese government across the global South. But these data sets almost always begin with commitments in the year 2000. There are important exceptions, and I'm going to get into these. So two of my colleagues, Dreyer and Fuchs, about 10 years ago, published, these are two development economists. They published a paper that looked at the 20th century sort of determinants of Chinese aid all over the world. More recently, there's a study by Horn et al. That looks at Chinese global lending, and they go all the way back to 1950. And these are really valuable studies that I am going to build off in this paper. But as I'm going to show you, they're based on very much incomplete historical records of China's aid and lending last century. So again, what do we miss out by not having these first 5 decades of China's aid and lending on the record? For one, I would argue that this is a pretty big omitted variable. I'm going to suggest to you that it's actually a bigger omitted variable than you might think. There is a lot of Chinese aid in the 20th century that I think we don't have full awareness of. And if we don't bring that into our analysis, we might not be able to generalize our findings, right? We could do a lot more if we could have these additional 5 decades of context, right? I'm also going to suggest that only looking at, say, 15 or 20 out of 70 or 80 years of aid and lending also limits our ability to contextualize and to sharpen how we think about, the best ways to measure different types of projects from China. And finally, this might also affect our ability to ask different research questions and to really expand this research. In particular, if you're someone who's interested or curious about how the past might affect the present, I'll give you an example of how we can use these data to look at those potential linkages. So that's the motivation for this. This is a big chunk of China's foreign policy historically that we typically don't account for. If you're someone who does study Chinese foreign aid, for example, most of us are aware that China's not a new donor or lender. This is often the first sentence in these papers. Yes, China's been a donor for a long time, but then the paper will proceed and focus on the 21st century. So in terms of analysis, there's not much. And to remedy this, what I wanted to do was fill that information gap and develop a comprehensive global data set of China's historical overseas aid. To do that, I started with some of this earlier work that myself and others have been involved in. If you're someone who is interested in Chinese foreign policy, Chinese foreign economic policy, the Belt and Road Initiative, you might be familiar with this. So for the past decade plus, a group of researchers, we've been basically building project level data on Chinese global development finance. The example that I'll give here, this is a project that I helped initiate at AidData called China's Global Loans and Grants Dataset. This is not the focus of this research today, but just very briefly, this is an open source data collection effort that draws on hundreds of thousands of information sources that are published by governments, by international organizations, by companies, by researchers like us, right? NGOs, media organizations, and triangulates between all of these different sources of data and produces unique project level information on Chinese development finance. The rationale for doing research like this is that there's a huge amount of curiosity in the world about, again, all of this, the Belt and Road Initiative, and even in the decade before that, China's reemergence as a major donor and lender in the global south. But China's government doesn't publish systematic records on its individual projects, right? We might get maybe aggregate annual amounts on China's aid budget from the Chinese government, but there's not a centralized database where we can look at all the projects that have been financed. So we've been building these data sets. These are really detailed, granular project level data sets. So there are hundreds of different variables that these data capture. As one example, one of the things we do is we make sure that we don't count all of these different projects and these types of financing in one simple category and call that, Chinese aid or Chinese development finance. We separate out projects that would resemble foreign aid if we were using definitions from the OECD Development Assistance Committee. Projects that would be aid-like, they would be classified probably as official development assistance, right? This is an OECD definition. We might want to do that, right? Because we might want to compare, for example, the effectiveness of Chinese aid to aid from the US, right? Or to aid from the World Bank. So we want to have apples to apples comparisons. So we separate out aid from projects that really aren't foreign aid in the traditional sense or in the strict definitional sense. They're not ODA, but they're more commercially oriented, less developmental official financing, particularly in the form of loan-based infrastructure projects. For shorthand, we call these debt projects, right? So we make this distinction between foreign aid and debt, basically. We also have some projects that we don't know. We don't have enough information to classify these as being aid or debt. And these are vague projects. So we for each project, we code it for all these different variables, and we make sure that we're sort of counting things in the right way. So the current data set includes over 20,000 project records. These are commitments of projects. This is valued cumulatively at over $1 trillion in over 140 countries. The most recent version of this data set, if you're interested, also includes Chinese overseas lending and grant making to high income countries as well. Another nearly 10,000 projects at almost $1 trillion. So this is all great, and we have detailed information. There are also other data sets available if you want to study this in the 21st century. Boston University also tracks China's development finance for the contemporary period. But this is the elephant in the room is that this starts in the year 2000. We don't have the historical record of China's aid and lending. Now, there have been a number of efforts by academics and researchers and institutions, including the Central Intelligence Agency during the Cold War, as well as the OECD. Lots of different actors have also been interested in this question of where and what is China giving in the global south during the 20th century. You can see some of the most prominent examples here. For example, Wolfgang Bartke, this was a German sinologist who used Chinese media reports during the Cold War. He basically used Xinhua news agency reports. And coded hundreds of Chinese aid projects around the world. He coded over 800 of them, right? More recently, there is a really interesting article by Morgan and Zhang that came out in International Studies Quarterly that tracks Chinese historical aid to African countries. And Morgan and Zhang took this method from aid data, which is called tracking underreported financial flows, or TUF, TUFF, and basically adapted it to study historical aid to African countries. You can see here they did a good job. They uncovered over 1,700 projects. Overall, however, if you look at this table, you see these different efforts, both individually, and even if we take all of these data and we put them together, this doesn't produce a comprehensive and certainly not a systematic record of China's historical development finance, right? So a lot of these efforts are great starting points, and some of these authors generously shared, their data with me for this project. But up until this point, we still don't have what we would call a systematic accounting that we could go and use to analyze China's historical aid. So this is really where this research comes in, and this is the contribution that it's looking to make, at least in terms of the empirics. So over the past 5 years, I built this data set called the Historical Chinese Development Finance Dataset, or HCDF for short. This has been a 5-year effort at the University of Hong Kong, where I'm based. This was a pre-Claude project. This is all human coded. I don't know if that makes it more or less impressive to you, but this was finished in the middle of 2025. We essentially took the ADATA's TUF methodology, and just like Morgan and Zhang, we adapted it to sort of serve our historical needs to deal with different types of sources. And you might be able to imagine what some of these challenges might be. This is a data set that ended up being very dependent on Chinese language sources. Turns out it's very difficult to survey all the developing countries in the world and find historical records of projects for them at scale. So we rely more on things like Chinese treaty databases, party state-run newspapers, including the Renmin Erbao. We also, again, I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that some of these authors were extremely generous in sharing the earlier data that they collected and allowed us to integrate it into the HCDF. So 5 years is a long time. A lot of things happen during data collection. I'm happy to answer any questions about that. For now, if you are willing to just sort of fast forward and assume that the data were collected, rigorously, and that these data can be trusted, and we can talk about some of the limitations. If we fast forward to today, this data set is complete. It is compatible with a data that I just mentioned. So what does that mean? We can now study Chinese development finance, not just over a 15-year period or a 20-year period, but over a 70+ year period, right? Not unlike the way we study aid from other major donors and lenders, right? As I'll get into, we also made some refinements to how we think about the best way to measure different types of Chinese projects. That's a point I'll come back to a little bit later. So this is I'm just going to show you a few examples of what some of these inputs look like into building these data. This is just a document from this treaty data set, Beida Fabao. You can see here, this is a example of information on an aid project to Sri Lanka. This is Wolfgang Bartke's data. You can see here, these are individual project descriptions. The Bartke data are very useful, but this is an example of how these earlier efforts didn't quite cast a comprehensive net. So what did Bartke do? He used Chinese media reports. And what happens when you rely on media reports for data collection? Well, you pick up projects that are reported in the media, and that tends to be more visible, bigger infrastructure projects. So this data by Bartke does a pretty good job of finding the most sort of high profile, the most visible infrastructure projects, but doesn't necessarily contain a full record of all of China's development cooperation. Similarly, this is declassified handbooks from the CIA. The CIA used to track communist aid to the Third World during the Cold War, and you can see examples of Chinese finance projects here. So again, what the HCDF is doing is taking all of these sources, putting them together, and creating unique project rows, right? And I'll give you an example shortly. So again, if you just trust me that we did a reasonably good job on this, and you probably shouldn't, you should ask questions about this. But if you fast forward to the finish line here, this is a comprehensive project level data set on China's 20th century development finance. So what does that mean? The data set includes over 4,000 unique project commitments, valued at over $160 billion. That's just in a deflated 2021 US dollars across 135 countries between 1950 and 1999. In my opinion, that's a big number. If you're familiar with sort of the history and in the present of Chinese foreign aid, we know that China is a massive lender today, but I think this figure is quite larger and more substantial than you may have thought, and I'll come back to that number in just a minute. But in terms of the projects themselves, what is also interesting here, we all think of China as a major infrastructure builder in the world today, and certainly it was during the first decade of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? Well, the data about a quarter of these projects are infrastructure projects. China is not a new infrastructure builder. And of those over 1,100 infrastructure projects, we code about 500, actually over 500 of those as being what you might call major infrastructure projects, national level, big projects. And we classify these into different types of infrastructure projects: high profile, prestige, and a social. And I'm going to give you an example of why doing that is really important shortly. Now, this is the first iteration of the data set. The plan is, of course, to publish it online soon and make it available for others to scrutinize and to hopefully use. And of course, we plan to update it in the future, but this is what the first version looks like. Now, $160+ billion is a lot of money, particularly if you consider that for a lot of the 20th century, particularly before 1978, before the 1990s, China itself was a very poor country, right? And if we're talking about the 1960s and 1970s, during the Cultural Revolution, China's own GDP per capita was probably a few $100s per year in some of these years. So when I realized that the data set was aggregating to this number, the first thing I did was go and look for official statistics from China's government on China's aid budget. And what you see here, if you look at the purple line, this is data from yearbooks of the Ministry of Finance. I was able to access historical yearbooks as well. And you can see that there was a big spike around 1969 and 1970. This very much is in line with what some of the historical literature says about Chinese development finance after the Sino-Soviet split, just before just before this very important 1971 vote in the UN General Assembly, in which the PRC becomes the legitimate representative of China to the UN. There's a big spike in China's foreign aid. And so you can see this purple line. These are aggregate annual aid expenditures from the Ministry of Finance. If you aggregate all of these projects in the HCDF up to the annual level, you get this greenish bluish line. And there's a couple of things that stand out here. Overall, this is I would say, a reassuring picture, but there are a couple of discrepancies that are worth mentioning. The first one is the timing, for example, of this big spike. The HCDF is capturing commitments of projects, right? The Ministry of Finance data capture annual expenditures. So I think this makes sense. It makes sense that commitments would come first and expenditures would come second. There's also this discrepancy if you get into the 1990s. And the reason for that is because the Ministry of Finance data on aid expenditures are limited to China's projects that China's government considers foreign aid. So it does not consider, for example, these more commercially oriented projects as being in this category. This is getting back to this definition of aid and debt that I mentioned earlier. This is a related point to that earlier distinction. The HCDF does capture this non-aid development finance from China's government. And this also fits, again, if you're familiar with sort of the backstory of China's development finance, one of the things that my colleagues wrote about in our book, Banking on Beijing, is how China basically transitioned around this time, the mid-1990s, early 2000s, from being an aid donor who provides the majority of its development finance in the form of concessional aid, to being a banker who provides, again, the bulk of its financing. and most of its portfolio in the form of what we would call debt. So we're kind of seeing the beginning of this transition as we get into the end of these historical data. So I think that's reassuring. But again, what's exciting about these data is that we can actually look at the project. So these are not aggregates. This is project level data. So here's an example of a project in the data set. This is basically a sports stadium that China built for Samoa with an interest-free loan of about 6 million CNY. You can see every project has a description. This project in particular was agreed upon in 1980. It was finished a few years later in time for the 7th South Pacific Games in 1983. There's some other, summary information about the project. You can also see that this record was built with maybe 6 or 7 different sources that corroborate each other. And then we have a protocol in our method for dealing with situations where we have conflicting information, for example. So this is what a typical infrastructure project looks like in the data set. If we look globally at where all these projects go, African countries receive about 60% of all the projects. Asian countries are about 23 or 24%. And Oceania, which is yellow here, Latin America, and Europe, particularly some of China's socialist allies, right, like Albania, they receive smaller portions of these data. But again, this is a global data set, so not specific to one region. We can also look at which countries, and I hope you all can see this, which countries receive the most projects in terms of the number of projects, which is over on the left-hand side, and the amount of projects on the right-hand side. And again, if you're someone who is familiar with the context of Chinese development finance, you wouldn't be surprised to see countries like Tanzania, Guinea, Mali, right, near the top of the list. These are some of the earliest and most prolific recipients of Chinese foreign aid. Similarly, a country like Albania, a socialist ally of China during the Cold War, receives the greatest number, or the most in terms of the dollar value of these projects. So happy to talk about any of that. A couple more just pieces of context on the data itself, and then we'll get into actually using the data. So the data set also codes projects in terms of what we call flow type. So was this project financed by a loan? Was it a donation or a grant that is non-repayable? Was it technical assistance? About a quarter of the projects are grants. Another 20% are loans. You can also see that we also have a lot of cases in the data set where we actually have very vague information, very little information. So for about 25% of the projects, we actually don't know what the flow type was. There are also scholarships, right? In some cases, technical assistance is a major category. And there's some instances of debt rescheduling as well. Now, coming back to what I just said about China's change from a donor to a banker, if you look at, so this is just the number of projects each year from 1950 to 1999. And what are these colors? So these yellow bars here are projects that are aid projects or ODA-like projects. Purple bars are the number of projects that are vague. We don't know, we can't confidently say whether this is an aid project or whether it's a debt project. Then if you can see, these bluish greenish bars represent debt financing, or OOF, other official flows. And again, these start to become a more relevant project class towards the end of the period as we start to move towards this donor to banker transition. What this is saying essentially is that this really lines up with this is kind of the origin story of what we talked about in Banking on Beijing. The first 5 decades of China's development finance, this was primarily an aid story. China was primarily an aid donor, which again, just descriptively is really remarkable when you think about what was happening domestically in China, economically and politically. A lot of this financing was highly concessional. Okay, finally, we can also see that China was a very diverse donor in the 20th century, just as it is today. In terms of sectors with the most projects, we see software sectors like health and education and agriculture near the top of the list, but we also see hardware sectors like transportation and energy and other industrial and mining sectors near the top as well. Okay, so that's just a snapshot on this data set, the HCDF. what I want to do now is stop just giving you statistics on the data and give you some examples of how we can put these data to use in a number of interesting ways. And I'm going to do three things. The first thing I'm going to do is look at the allocation of Chinese development finance. In research on political economy of aid, we are interested in allocation because we think it tells us something about what donors and lenders want, right? So it's not a perfect measure. It's hard to know what, different governments' true intentions are. But a lot of people look at allocation as some sort of signal, some sort of piece of information about what's motivating them to provide a development finance. So we'll look at the allocation. Then I'm going to give you an example again on how these historical data can actually improve our measures of Chinese development finance. And then I'm going to come back to this link on the past and the present and whether or not all this historical financing actually shapes how China engages in the global south today. So on allocation, I guess I want to provide one piece of context here, which is that, again, if you're familiar with this literature, the study of Chinese foreign economic, particularly China's development finance, is really a study that emphasizes evolution and change. There are a lot of studies that like to split China's financing into different periods, right? And you can probably, if you study China, you can think of what some of those might be. For example, 1978, right? Or after the Sino-Soviet split, right? So the emphasis and the orientation in this literature is really about change, how China's approach to development finance is shifting over time. I'm going to do something a little bit different and see if there are continuities in this approach. And what we find, and if you look here, I hope this is big enough for everyone, but the first three columns, so these are just a set of statistical tests that I did. These happen to be logistic regressions where the dependent variable is the likelihood of receiving Chinese financing in a given year for a given country. In columns 1 to 3, we're just looking across countries in the world. So this is a cross-national analysis of aid allocation. Again, this is sort of a classic approach in the literature on development finance, on aid and lending. And then columns 4 to 6 are basically the same thing, but we're going to add in country fixed effects and look at changes over time within countries as well. The first column is the historical data set, is the HCDF. The third column is ADATA's 21st century data. And then the middle column is a subset of the historical data, basically 1971 to 1999. After China joins, the PRC joins the United Nations, we can include things like its voting behavior in the UN. The overall point that I just want to briefly show you is that despite dramatic changes in China's domestic political economy and, again, as others have emphasized, its approach to development finance. One of the best examples is after the death of Mao in 1976, after Deng comes to power, we know that there's a pretty fundamental reorientation of a lot of China's foreign policies, right? Including China's foreign aid. This is a period that is known as sort of recalibration and scaling back, right? So we know there are these big shifts in China's orientation as a donor. We also know that China becomes a major recipient, during some of this time as well. Despite all of that, there are some continuities that are worth mentioning. There is a developmental continuity. So within the global south, developing countries that are poorer, that have a lower level of per capita development, continue to be more likely to receive projects from China's government. There's also a consistent political and diplomatic logic. So this probably doesn't surprise anyone, but countries that recognize Taiwan diplomatically are always unlikely to get aid from China. In addition, countries that vote more in line with China in the UN General Assembly, and here the measure is basically ideal points distance, using one of the major data sets on this by Wooten, shows that countries that vote more with China are more likely to receive aid. So this is true regardless of period, right? Similarly, if we periodicize China's aid and we go decade by decade, and this is what is shown in this table here, but we can also even choose specific periods if you think there are important cut points in China's history that we should look at. The results are very consistent. So this developmental and then this sort of political strategic logic are very consistent. Now, again, I want to come back to a point I made at the very beginning. That doesn't necessarily mean China is a unique donor or lender. We've always thought in the political economy of aid literature that major donors and lenders are strategic, right? They provide foreign aid to achieve different economic and political and security objectives. And this is not necessarily different than that. If anything, this is showing that this is extremely consistent despite major shifts in China's position. So with regard to allocation, this is not necessarily saying that, these changes didn't happen, but there's also, I think, some underappreciated continuity. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is what I call measuring what matters, right? So the tables that I just showed you were just looking at all of the projects that China financed, right? I talked a little bit about the difference between aid and debt. But I want to look particularly at infrastructure because infrastructure is a topic that I myself am quite interested in and for which there's a lot of interest in, particularly people focusing on the Belt and Road Initiative. So this is another example of a project in the data set. This was actually the project there was an image of this project on the first slide of the presentation. This is a hydroelectric station in Burundi that China's government sponsored. It financed and constructed beginning in the 1970s. It was finished in the early 1980s. So it was also financed with a $9.5 million USD loan. And again, you can just see the description of the project here. Wonderful. Another typical major infrastructure project that China financed historically. Here are a few other projects in Burundi that are also in the data set. The first one, it says China assisted with a high voltage power transmission project. So this is a transmission infrastructure project. This is a very vague project. We don't know how much it cost. We don't know when it started. We don't know exactly where it was in Burundi. We have a lot of missing information. The second project is a disaster relief project in which China donated some agricultural tools in 1991. These are all projects to Burundi. This is a lot different than the other projects that we looked at, right? The third project is a donation from the Chinese Red Cross, $10,000, much, much, much smaller project for treatment and prevention of dysentery. The point here is that the data set includes a lot of different types of projects, and these projects are very different, but even within the same sectors, even if we just look at the energy sector or the water sector, right, or the transport sector, let's say that we're looking at a set of 500 projects, those projects are going to vary dramatically, and only some of those projects are the projects that we think really matter, these big major infrastructure projects. So what we did when we were building the HCDF was we went through and we added new variables for specific types of infrastructure projects. And I'm going to focus on three types right now. The first type is called high profile infrastructure. This is a very broad category, as you'll see. You can basically, this is sort of what we think of when we think of the Belt and Road Initiative. These are big commercial economic infrastructure projects, mostly in energy, transportation, and other industrial hardware sectors. So a very broad category. This is an example of a contemporary high-profile project along the Belt and Road Initiative. This is the Coletta Hydropower Station. It was built about 10 years ago with a loan from China Exim Bank for about $300 or $400 million in Guinea, again, a historical recipient of aid from China. If you travel about 400 kilometers away from this project, you can get to this project, which is the Kinkin Falls Hydroelectric Station. This is the first overseas hydroelectric station that China built in Africa. It was built about 50 years earlier. This is a historical aid project. These are both high-profile infrastructure projects. Okay, so just a quick illustration on those. The next type is a prestige project. So I wrote a paper a couple of years ago about these. These are also big national infrastructure projects, but these are nationally symbolic projects like stadiums, convention centers, government buildings, right? Like parliament buildings or government ministries. There's been a lot of news articles about these over the years. This is a national football stadium that China built for Costa Rica in 2011. A few years after Costa Rica had severed diplomatic ties with Taiwan. The final category is what I call social infrastructure. Again, big national infrastructure, but in the software sectors of education, health. So this is a hospital that China built in Mauritania in the 1970s, and agriculture. So these are three different classes of big infrastructure projects that China's government has been building for a long time. If we include all three of these categories, in the 20th century, China built over 500 of these projects. It built almost 2,000 of these projects in the 21st century during the global infrastructure spree during the Belt and Road Initiative. But these big projects have historical roots. These are types of projects that China's been building for a long time. So if we return to allocation, but we now have a sharper measure of really what we want to focus on here, what we can see here is that these three types of infrastructure projects have different strategic logics. They have different economic and political logics from the perspective of China. If we look at high-profile projects, so this is basically the same analytical setup as I just looked at, but now we're looking specifically at high-profile prestige and social infrastructure. In short, high-profile projects have a commercial logic to them. This is in line with what we talk about, again, in our contemporary analysis and banking on Beijing. These projects tend to go to bigger emerging economies within the global south. Prestige projects go to small developing countries that don't have the capacity to build these projects themselves and who increase their support for China by recognizing the PRC, recognizing the One China policy. So these projects are more politically motivated, more diplomatically and politically motivated. Social infrastructure projects are more developmental. They go to smaller and poorer countries within the global south. Now, what's cool here is that we're analyzing these classes for a much greater study period than we would have been able to, right, without this data set. This is a much bigger sample and a much bigger analysis, so the findings are more generalizable. And again, this is really neat because for all the emphasis on change in China's approach to financing infrastructure and financing development, there are some consistent logics of these different types of projects. And we can only see that when we're more careful about how we measure these things. Okay, the last illustration is thinking a little bit about how we can actually think creatively about building new theories and maybe extending out this research agenda on Chinese development finance. The specific example I'll show you, but I'm happy to talk about others, is thinking about these potential links between the past and the present. So we now know that China's government gave a lot of foreign aid in the 20th century. And of course, China's the biggest, bilateral creditor in the world today. So is there any link between these two periods of economic engagement? A lot of China scholars and IR scholars have been interested in this question for a long time. A number of studies have looked at rhetorical links between the past and the present. For example, how China's government and how counterpart governments mobilize historical memory for contemporary goals. That's a little bit different, but I think a very interesting line of inquiry. We can also look at behavior and whether or not these historical projects have had legacy effects that shape China's economic engagement today. This is what Morgan and Jung did in their study. So again, if you think back to their study, they were looking at Chinese aid to Africa, and they argue that these historical projects matter for real outcomes in the world today. Specifically, what they find is that contemporary Chinese FDI is shaped in part by historical aid. So countries in Africa that received a lot of aid from China historically are also host to greater numbers of FDI flows in the 21st century. And the argument is pretty straightforward. They essentially argue that historical aid generated social capital and relationships and networks that required, aid workers and engineers and diplomats and different Chinese actors to go and spend time in these countries, and in some cases remain in these countries for a long time and develop and become part of the community, essentially. And then when investors went abroad with the going out strategy in the early 2000s, there were already some existing communities and sets of relationships that made it easier for them to invest in certain places. We also know more generally that donors use aid to promote economic goals, right? They promote their exports, right? They promote trade, right? So there's a lot of evidence more generally outside of China that aid can lead to different types of economic flows in the future. So just as a quick illustration, and just to sort of test whether or not there might be something to this, I extended the findings of Morgan and Jung, now with a global sample, obviously, and a more comprehensive sample. And I also looked at some other contemporary flows. And what we can see is whether it's the FDI finding from Morgan and Jung, or its trade, both imports and exports with China, and China's development finance today, all of these contemporary engagements are positively associated with greater sort of exposure to historical aid from China. This is not necessarily an identified result. There's no exogenous variation here, but these are very strong positive associations that I think suggest that this idea that the past may shape and may set in place processes that shape contemporary, flows of capital probably merits further investigation. So I think this is an exciting example of how we can use these data to think about new questions. Okay, so let me wrap up and then we can have a discussion together. So the reason I think this data set is really neat and exciting is that we can use it to revisit foundational questions, and ideally with greater certainty. We can look at allocation, but with a stronger, with a stronger empirical foundation, right? We can challenge some of these existing ways of thinking about Chinese development finance. There's no need for the past and the present to be separated just because of missing data. We can also ask new questions, and we can improve how we measure different types of Chinese development finance. So for much of the past decade, there's been a tremendous emphasis on the difference between aid and debt. But I think we should also be thinking about different types of infrastructure, like in the example that I gave, and more generally, ways in which these projects differ in qualitatively meaningful ways. There's some ongoing work, so there's also a subnational version of this data set that we're using to examine some other questions. There are over 6,000 project events in the data set as well. So these could be used to do event studies. And I guess finally, just to feature a couple of my students, there's a number of papers that are now being written based on these data. One of them is with a student of mine. We're looking at this phenomenon of revival infrastructure projects. This is basically this phenomenon where we find over 100 instances of China's government taking these historical Cold War infrastructure projects and spending billions of dollars today or in recent years reviving them. And we tell a story about how this is related to creating nostalgic diplomatic capital. Another study with a couple of my students at HKU is not directly using these data. This is actually a survey-based study, but we're looking at whether and how governments, in this case China, can make historical references to, for example, its historical development finance to affect support for aid in contemporary China, right? There's a lot of skepticism among some observers in China. There are questions about why the Belt and Road was so big. And just like in every other country, why is so much money being spent on outgoing foreign aid when we have problems at home that we might want to fix? We see whether this historical referencing can shape support for these projects. So I'll stop here. Thank you again, and I look forward to your questions.
And congratulations for compiling an impressive database and also make a big scholarly contribution to the study of China and development finance. I have a couple of questions, but for folks in the room as well as folk online, get your questions ready. So I did take notes. The first question for you, I did take notes from the kind of data intense page where you see what you were showing, what were included in the page in the database. Which on one page you said that database include over 4,200 project commitment, valued at over $160 billion to 135 countries between 1950 and 1999. So I'm just curious, when you include a commitment, does the project also distinguish between commitment versus actual disbursement, or thinking about disbursement is not necessarily important to understand where China wants to go?
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. And we can go one at a time. I have a mic. It's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you. So this is a question that I have been dealing with for a long time, because the same question comes up when we build the contemporary data too. So I should have a good answer for this. So the data indeed are commitment data. And there are many cases in which we don't know if all of the money that was committed was spent. I want to be very honest about that. There are a lot of other really important variables in the data set. One of them is status. So we do track the status of every project to the best we can. So we know in most cases whether a project was actually finished. whether it was abandoned, whether it was committed but never started. So we have that information, but there's really no way to collect disbursements on these projects. There's no public record of that. So that has, consequences for things like how you analyze the data. If you're interested, for example, in whether Chinese aid affects, a certain outcome, you may have to introduce lags into the analysis and things like that. And indeed, there may be projects that we have a commitment value for. Maybe it's a really big value. And in the end, that project may be canceled or mothballed. And that is a reality. On the other hand, there's something else I should be very open about. So we're missing financial information for the majority of projects in the data set. There's a good reason for that, though. A lot of this financing, both now but also in the 20th century, is announced in bundles. So give you an example. If a country in China established diplomatic relations in 1970, there may have been a package of projects or a package of financing that was announced, and it may include 7 or 8 different projects under it. And we might not know the individual project value for each project. So we may know that China gave out a $100 million loan, and it was going to be used for a sugar refinery and a factory over here and a brick factory and a road. We don't know the individual values. It appears in the data that we're missing all that information for each project, but we actually have a pretty complete, as I showed with the comparison to the Ministry of Finance, I think a reasonably wholesome sort of aggregate count. Nonetheless, these are commitments, not disbursements. So you're right about that.
No, this is actually very valuable contribution to understand the pattern of China's approach to development finance. Because if you only look at the data starting from 2020, the aid data that I myself use a lot, and thank you for your leadership in building the database. If you don't use the data carefully, you might end up arriving at the conclusion that China's aid or development finance approach started when China started to grow very fast. But from the chart that you show historical data, it actually shows, in fact, China started to engage with development finance and aid, despite the fact that China was relatively poor. Right. So I find that chart is very impressive. And I have another question, and then I will open the floor to our participants. All right. So the question that I have for you, Austin, is about the pattern. You showed us the consistency part of it, but I'm just also curious in terms of whether there are, from your various research across different stages, is there any cyclicality pattern or cyclical patterns that how China approaches to development finance, whether it's aid, more grant, more murky, we don't know, anything like that, based upon the speed of growth, based upon domestic challenges, or how China's role in the world, China's relationship with the rest of the world change.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. Right. So I was bent on showing continuities, but I don't want to underplay. There are major changes as well. So just to make sure this context is clear, the literature has already spent a lot of time talking about the changes, and I'm trying to suggest that actually there are some roots here that have been around for a while. But yeah, there are, I wouldn't call it cyclic, but I think there are some key moments so I actually don't think there are cyclic patterns, although I have to sort of investigate that, more rigorously. I could be wrong, but there are key moments of change. I mentioned a couple already, I think. So typically the way that we sort of think about this progression is the early years of the PRC, say the first decade or so. China's foreign aid was very limited, both regionally, and it was very focused on communist countries. China was more or less aligned with the Soviet Union. After the Sino-Soviet split, and again, particularly towards the buildup of sort of the late 1960s. So throughout the 60s, Mao decides, right, that China's foreign policy is going to move in a more radical direction, and China is going to try to be the leader of this global socialist movement, right? I read a really interesting article this morning about the logic of sort of the poor helping the poor, just to your point just now, and sort of how China's leaders were thinking about this at the time. But in any case, this is when we see a major ramping up in terms of China's aid becoming global, going, throughout the African continent, throughout Asia, eventually making its way to Latin America. And of course, the next big point would be sort of the scaling back. And there was a recognition in the mid 1970s that this revolutionary aid period that I just described was becoming untenable. And just to give you a sense, so the figures I put up were how much, what is the annual aid budget, right, in terms of dollars? You can also put that as a percentage of the national budget. And if you do that, it gets even more remarkable. It goes, so if you, I always ask this to my students, what percent of the US budget do we spend on foreign aid? Well, it's not very much anymore, but even previously, it's a lot less than people think. So just to give you an index, for a few years in the late 60s and early 70s, Chinese aid, and this is even if you don't use my data set, if you just use Ministry of Finance figures, as a percentage of the national budget was over 5%. That's truly remarkable. Even in the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the US were, using foreign aid to cultivate client states and compete for global influence, rarely did aid go above 2% of GDP for those countries, sometimes not even over 1%. So that was seen as untenable in the mid 70s. We see a scaling back in the 80s and 90s. China's known as more of a recipient during that period, right? Major recipient of loans from the World Bank and Japan. And then we see the architecture of sort of China's going out strategy, as you're very familiar with, put in place in the 1990s. So I know I zoomed through that, but those are some of the key cut points, I would say, in the 20th century.